Welcome to the online class lecture of Professor S.K. Paul, University Department of English, BRABU University, Muzaffarpur. Good morning, dear students of PG Semester 2, CC 6, Unit 4. Today I am going to deliver my lecture on Robert Browning and the themes of his poetry. Robert Browning was a major English poet of the Victorian age, noted for his mastery of dramatic monologue and psychological portraiture. His most noted work was The Ring and the Book, published in 1869, the story of a Roman murder trial in 12 books. Robert Browning was the son of a clerk in the Bank of England in London. Browning received only a slight formal education, although his father gave him a grounding in Greek and Latin. In 1828, he attended classes at the University of London, but he left after half a session. Apart from a journey to St. Petersburg in 1834 with George D. Benghausen, the Russian Consul General, and two short visits to Italy in 1838 and 1844. He lived with his parents in London until 1846, first at Camberwell and after 1840 at Hatcham. During this period, 1832 to 1846, he wrote his early long poems and most of his plays. Browning's first published work, Pauline, Browning's first published work, Pauline, a fragment of a confession. It was published 1833, anonymous, although formally a dramatic monologue, embodied many of his own adolescent passions and anxieties. Although it received some favorable comment, it was attacked by John Stuart Mill, who condemned the poet's exposure and exploitation of his own emotions and his intense and morbid self-consciousness. It was perhaps Mill's critique that determined Browning never to confess his own emotions again in his poetry, but to write objectively. In 1835, he published Paracelsus, and in 1840, Sordello, both poems dealing with men of great ability striving to reconcile the demands of their own personalities with those of the world. Paracelsus was well received, but Sordello, which made exacting demands on its readers' knowledge, was almost universally declared incomprehensible. Encouraged by the actor Charles Macready, Browning devoted his main energies for some years to verse drama, a form that he had already adopted for Stratford between 1841 and 1846 in a series of pamphlets under the general title of Bells and Pomegranates. He published 7 more plays in verse, including Pippa Passes, 1841, a plot in the Scythian produced in 1843 and Luria in 1846. These and all his earlier works, except Stratford, were printed at his family's expense, although Browning enjoyed writing for the stage. He was not successful in the theatre, since his strength lay in depicting, as he had himself observed of Stratford, action in character rather than character in action. By 1845, the first phase of Browning's life was near its end. In that year, he met Elizabeth Barrett. In her poems 1844, Barrett had included lines praising Browning, who wrote to thank her in January 1845. In May, they met and soon discovered their love for each other. Barrett had, however, been for many years an invalid, confined to her room and thought incurable. Her father, moreover, was a dominant and selfish man, jealously fond of his daughter, who in turn had come to depend on his love. When her doctors ordered her to Italy for her health, and her father refused to allow her to go, the lovers, who had been corresponding and meeting regularly, were forced to act. They were married secretly in September 1846. A week later, they left for Pisa. Throughout their married life, although they spent holidays in France and England, their home, as in Italy, mainly at Florence, where they had flat in a Casa Gaeti, their income was small. Although after the birth of their son, Robert, in 1849, Mrs. Browning's cousin, John Kenyon, made them an allowance of £100 a year, and on his death in 1856, he left them £11,000. Browning produced comparatively little poetry during his married life. Apart from a collected edition in 1849, he published only Christmas Eve and Easter Day, 1850, an examination of different attitudes toward Christianity, perhaps having its immediate origin in the death of his mother in 1849. An introductory essay, 1852, to some spurious letters of Shelley, Browning's only considerable work in prose, and his only piece of critical writing, and Men and Women in 1855. This was a collection of 51 poems. Dramatic lyrics such as Memorabilia, Love Among the Ruins, and a toccata of Galuppi's The Great Monologues such as Fra Lippo Lippi, How It Strikes to Contemporary, and Bishop Blogram's Apology, and a very few poems in which implicitly by the fireside or explicitly one word more. He broke his rule and spoke of himself and of his love for his wife. Men and Women. Men and Women, however, had no great sale, and many of the reviews were unfavorable and unhelpful. Disappointed for the first time by reception of his work, Browning in the following years wrote little sketching and modeling in clay by day, and enjoying the society of his friends at night. At last, Mrs. Browning's health, which had been remarkably restored by her life in Italy, began to fail On June 29, 1861, she died in her husband's arms. In the autumn, he returned slowly to London with his young son. His first task on his return was to prepare his wife's last poems. At first, he avoided company, but gradually he accepted invitations more freely and began to move in society. Another collected edition of his poems was called for in 1863, but Pauline was not included. When his first book of poems, Dramatis Personae, published in 1864, including Abd Vogler, Rabbi Ben Ezra, a Caliban upon Setibos, and Mr. Schuss, the medium, reached two editions, it was clearly that Browning had at last won a measure of popular recognition. In 1868-69, he published his great work, The Ring and the Book, based on the proceedings in a murder trial in Rome in 1898. Grand alike its plan and execution, it was at once received with enthusiasm, and Browning was established as one of the most important literary figures of the day. For the last of his life, he was much in demand in London society. He spent his summers with friends in France, Scotland, and Switzerland, or after 1878 in Italy. The most important works of his last years, when he wrote with great fluency, were the long narrative or dramatic poems of him dealing with contemporary themes such as Prince Hohenstiel, Shavagn, 1871, Fiffin at the Fair, 1872, Red Cotton Nightcap Country, 1873, The In Album, 1875, and the two series of dramatic idols, 1879 and Adventure, and 1880. He wrote a number of poems on classical subjects, including Beloson's Adventure, 1871, and Aristophanes' Apology, 1875. In addition to many collections of shorter poems, Pacchiarotto and How He Worked in Distemper, 1876, Jacoseria, 1883, Firishta's Fancies, 1884, and Asolando Fancies and Facts, 1869. Browning published toward the end of his life two books of unusually personal origin, La Caesius, 1878, and once an elegy for his friend Annie Egerton Smith, and a meditation on mortality and parallelings with certain people of importance in their day, 1887, in which he discussed books and ideas that had influenced him since his youth. While staying in Venice in 1889, Browning caught cold, became seriously ill, and died on December 12. He was buried in Westminster Abbey. Few poets have suffered more than Browning from hostile incomprehension or misplaced admiration, both arising very often from a failure to recognize the predominantly dramatic nature of his work. The bulk of his writing before 1846 was for the theatre. Thereafter, his major poems showed his increasing mastery of the dramatic monologue. This consists essentially of a narrative spoken by a single character and amplified by his comments on his story and the circumstances in which he is speaking from his own knowledge of the historical or other events described, or else by influence from the poem itself. The reader is eventually enabled to assess the intelligence and honesty of the narrator and the value of the views he expresses. This type of dramatic monologue, since it depends on the unconscious provision by the speaker of the evidence by which the reader is to judge him, is eminently suitable for the ironist. Browning's fondness for this form has, however, encouraged the two most common misconceptions of the nature of his poetry, that it is deliberately obscure and that its basic message is a facile optimism. Neither of these criticisms is groundless, both are incomplete. Browning is not always difficult. In many poems, especially short lyrics, he achieves effects of obvious felicity. Nevertheless, his superficial difficulties, which prevent an easy understanding of the sense of a passage, are evident enough. His attempts to convey the broken and irregular rhythms of speech make it almost impossible to read the verse quickly. His elliptical syntax sometimes disconcerts and confuses the reader, but can be mastered with little effort. Certain poems, such as Sordello or Old Pictures in Florence, require a considerable acquaintance with their subjects in order to be understood, and his fondness for putting his monologues into the mouths of charlatans and sophists in elliptical syntax sometimes disconcerts and confuses the reader, but can be mastered with. Such as Sardello or Old Pictures in Florence, require a considerable acquaintance with their subjects in order to be understood, and his fondness for putting his monologues into the mouths of charlatans and sophists such as Mr. Sage or Napoleon III obliges the reader to follow a chain of subtle or paradoxical arguments. All these characteristics stand in the way of easy reading. But even when individual problems of style and technique have been resolved, the poem's interest is seldom exhausted. First, Browning often chooses an unexpected point of view, especially in his monologues, thus forcing the reader to accept an unfamiliar perspective. Second, he is capable of startling changes of focus within a poem. For example, he chooses subjects in themselves insignificant, as in Fra Lippo Lippi and Master Higgs of Saxicota, and treats through them the eternal themes of poetry. This transition from particular observation to transcendental presents much the same challenge to the reader as to the metaphysical poets of the 17th century, and much the same excitement. Third, because Browning seldom presents a speaker without irony, there is a constant demand on the reader to appreciate exactly the direction of satiric force in the poem. Even in a melodious poem such as a toccata of Galuppi's, the valid position must be distinguished from the false at every turn of the argument. While in a major casuistic monologues such as Bishop Blockram's Apology, the shifts of sympathy are subtler still. It has also been objected that Browning uses his poetry as a vehicle for his philosophy, which is not of itself profound or interesting, being limited to an easy optimism. But Browning's dramatic monologues must, as he himself him, insisted, be recognized as the utterances of fictitious persons drawing their strength from their appropriateness in characterizing the speaker, and not as expressions of Browning's own sentiments. Thus, his great gallery of imagined characters is to be regarded as an exhaustive catalogue of human motives, not as a series of self-portraits. Nevertheless, a certain Browning's personal beliefs, such as his Christian faith, in matters of human conduct, his sympathies are he is in general on the side of those who commit themselves wholeheartedly to an ideal, even if they fail. By itself, this might suggest rather a naive system of values, yet he also sometimes, even in the same poem, shows his understanding of those who have been forced to lower their standards and accept a compromise. Thus, although Browning is far from taking a cynical or pessimistic view of man's nature or destiny, his hopes for the world are not simple and unreasonable. In The Ring and the Book, Browning displays all his distinctive qualities. He allows a dramatic monologue to each character he portrays, to the man on trial for murder, to his young wife, whom he has mortally wounded to her protector, to various Roman citizens, to the opposing layers, and to the Pope, who ultimately decides the accused's fate. Each monologue deals with substantially the same occurrences, but each, of course, describes and interprets them differently by permitting the true facts to emerge gradually by inference from these conflicting accounts. Browning reveals with increasing subtlety the true natures of his characters, as each great monologue illuminates the moral being of the speaker. It becomes clear that nothing less than the whole ethical basis of human actions is in question. For over 20,000 lines, Browning explores his theme, employing an unfaltering blank verse, rising often to passages of moving poetry, realizing in extraordinary detail the life of 17th century Rome, and creating a series of characters as diverse and finally realized as those in any novel. During Browning's lifetime, critical recognition came rapidly after 1864, and although his books never sold as well as his wife's or Tennyson's, he thereafter acquired a considerable and enthusiastic public. In the 20th century, his reputation, along with those of the other great Victorians, declined, and his work did not enjoy a wide reading public, perhaps in part because of increasing skepticism of the values implied in his poetry. He has, however, influenced many modern poets such as Robert Frost and Ezra Pound, partly through his development of the dramatic monologue, with its emphasis on the psychology of the individual and his stream of consciousness, but even more through his success in writing about the variety of modern life in language that owed nothing to convention, as long as technical accomplishment, richness of texture, a sustained imaginative power, and a vast interest in humanity are counted virtues. Browning will be numbered among the great English poets. So, some themes of Browning's poetry. So, multiple perspectives on single events. The dramatic monologue verse form allowed Browning to explore and probe the minds of specific characters in specific places, struggling with specific sets of circumstances. In The Ring and the Book, Browning tells a suspenseful story of murder using multiple voices, which give multiple perspectives and multiple versions of the same story. Dramatic monologues allow readers to enter into the minds of various characters and to see an event from that character's perspective. Understanding the thoughts, feelings, and motivations of a character not only gives readers a sense of sympathy for the characters, but also helps readers understand the multiplicity of perspectives that make up the truth. In effect, Browning's work reminds readers that the nature of truth or reality fluctuates depending on one's perspective or view of the situation. Multiple perspectives illustrate the idea that no one sensibility or perspective sees the whole story, and no two people see the same events in the same way. Same events in the same way. Browning further illustrates this idea by writing poems that put together as as companion pieces, such as Fra Lippo Lippi and Andrea del Sarto. Poems such as these show how people with different characters respond differently to similar situations, as well as depict how a time, place, and scenario can cause people with similar personalities to develop or change quite dramatically. The purposes of art. Another aspect. Browning wrote many poems about artists and poets, including such dramatic monologues as Victor Ignotus in 1855, Fra Lippo Lippi. Frequently, Browning would begin by thinking about an artist and artwork or a type of art that he admired, admired or disliked. Then he would speculate on the character or artistic philosophy that would lead to such a success or failure. His dramatic monologues about artists attempt to capture some of his philosophizing, because his characters speculate on the purposes of art. For instance, the speaker of Fra Lippo Lippi proposes that art heightens our powers of observation and helps us notice things about our own lives. According to some of these characters and poems, painting idealizes the beauty found in the real world, such as the radiance of a beloved's smile. Sculpture and architecture can memorialize famous or important people, as in the bishop orders his tomb at St. Praxed's Church, 1845. And the statue and the bust, 1855. But art also helps its creators to make a living, and it thus has a purpose as pecuniary as creative, an idea explored in Andrea del Sarto. The relationship between art and morality. Throughout his work, Browning tried to answer questions about an artist's responsibilities and to describe the relationship between art and morality. He questioned whether artists had an obligation to be moral and whether artists should pass judgment on their characters and creations. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Browning populated his poems with evil people who commit crimes and sins ranging from hatred to murder. The dramatic monologue format allowed Browning to maintain a great distance between himself and his creations by channeling the voice of a character. Browning could explore evil without actually being evil himself. His characters served as persona that let him adopt different traits and tell stories about horrible situations. In My Last Duchess, the speaker gets away with his wife's murder, since neither his audience in the poem nor his creator judges or judges or criticizes him. Instead, the responsibility of judging the character's morality is left to readers who find the Duke of Ferrara a vicious, repugnant person even as he takes us on a tour of his art gallery. Robert Browning is better known as a major Victorian poet and in particular as one who perfected the influential verse form called dramatic monologue. His achievement is his achievement in poetry for which for which he for which he forsook the theatre altogether in 1846 was unquestionably much greater than what he accomplished as a writer of stage plays, yet it is difficult and unwise to distinguish the subject matter of techniques of Browning's failed dramas from those of his successful poems. Although he was by nature and inclination a dramatic writer, it became apparent that his peculiar interests and talent in that line were more suited to the finer medium of poetry than to the practical exigencies of stagecraft. The verse confirms his acknowledged preoccupation with interior drama, action in character, not character in action. Preoccupation with interior drama, action in character, not character in action. Browning's first masterpieces in this mode include Porphyria's Lover, My Last Duchess, The Bishop Orders His Tomb at St. Prax's Church, Henri del Sarto, Love Among the Ruins, The Last Ride Together, and The Ring and the Book. A dramatic monologue by Browning typically features an incandescent moment of crisis or self-realization in the mental life of some unusual, often morally or psychologically flawed character. Rather, like a soliloquy, except in being addressed to a present but silent listener, this type of poem enabled Browning to let his speaker's personalities, motives, obsessions, and delusions be revealed inadvertently or otherwise in speech and implied gesture. This preoccupation with involved psychological drama, with the springs of action rather than with action itself, is the origin of Browning's greatness as a poet and of his limitations as a stage-worthy playwright. In 19th and early 20th century criticism, Browning was widely considered to be the best English writer of dramatic literature, though not of stageable plays since the Renaissance. That subject was probably accurate enough, if only because of the remarkable dearth of fine drama during the 200 years in question. Even today, especially if Browning's splendid dramatic monologues are included in the estimate, there can be little doubt that his achievement was under the circumstances extraordinary. Nevertheless, any evaluation of his plays must begin by conceding that despite his hopes, practical theatrical craft in the ordinary sense was never in Browning's vein of genius. He was a first-rate dramatic poet, not a good technical playwright. Indeed, the very themes and methods that mark the play's literary value are the source of all their unsuitability for successful performance. One historical explanation of this failure, yes, yes, who is talking? One historical explanation of this failure is the romantic concept of acted and unacted drama. Browning has been associated with a widespread and consciously authentical attitude among the authors that resulted in plays composed with indifference to performative as opposed to literary or expressive criteria. If Browning did believe on principle that actual staging is not necessary to serious drama, it is less surprising that his own plays are satisfactory chiefly as reading texts. On the other hand, Browning did press persistently to see of his work on the boards. In any case, Browning's plays have never been popular, and with the exception of Pippa Passes, are not usually numbered among his most important contributions to the history of English dramatic writing. Their lasting excellence then is in their objective poetry and prose, as in the verse collections to which he gave titles such as Dramatic Lyrics 1842, in Bells and Pomegranate 1841 to 1846, Dramatis Personae 1864, and Dramatis Itis. So this way, dear students, I have completed my lecture for today. Today's lecture is over. Thank you all.